Yeah, joining me, Eang Ngov, a constitutional law professor with Barry University. And I want to kind of start, is we kind of watch this on the outside. Democrats appear to have the votes they need. It looks as though President Donald Trump, poised to become the third president in history to be impeached. To that point, if that is how this plays out, what is the mark in the history books?
This is going to have a huge impact in our history for a significant number of reasons. First, it will give us context for what Congress perceives as the Constitution's high crimes and misdemeanor. So we're going to see from these hearings a congressional perspective about the content of the Constitution. What's an impeachable offense? We're also going to have an opportunity to see the procedural aspect, since impeachment hearings don't happen quite so frequently. And so what this will do historically is will provide for future congressional bodies the procedure and the protocol that they might rely upon later on.
Well, that's an interesting point too, because leading up to this, we hear a lot about the thoughts of the founding fathers and the interpretation of the Constitution. So as a constitutional law professor, the arguments that you've heard and the reliance upon what the founding fathers may have intended, how the Constitution is being interpreted in different ways, what strikes you? What stands out?
So the two contested articles of impeachment, there's pushback from the Republicans on both articles, the abuse of power. And so this is a great opportunity for us to get a better understanding from a congressional viewpoint of these two charges, the abuse of power. Was the Constitution intended to include as an impeachable offense the abuse of power? And also, what does the interplay between the legislative and the executive branch, how does that impact the Constitution? So what's interesting in this process is that the president had directed his officials not to testify, even under subpoena, and he's been, in effect, asserting this executive privilege to keep communication within the executive private. And this becomes an interesting constitutional law question because it's not been tested frequently on what executive privilege means. And so it's interesting because the House has the power to impeach, and yet, as it's trying to assert that power by subpoenaing witnesses, you have then the pushback from the executive. And so this is a constitutional question that is not answered and will be answered through these impeachment hearings.
When you kind of talk about that separation of powers, and that's one thing that Democrats have really talked about why they are inspired to pursue impeachment, we're coming up to 2020, and a lot of people seem as though there's just a lot of political fatigue out there, especially just kind of in society, as Republicans control the Senate. Because if impeachment passes the House, ultimately it is up to the Senate to actually carry out the trial, to be the jury with the Chief Justice overseeing the proceedings. And it's not likely that the Senate, controlled by Republicans, would actually remove the president. So I guess, where are we in the sense societally? Is there a payoff to impeaching the president when the Senate likely isn't going to remove him? So some would argue, what's the point?
Sure. Well, I think as a matter of society, if the public believes that there are misconduct and impeachable offenses, that the process gives integrity to our Constitution. And so even if the result will not yield what the public would want, assuming that's what the public wants, I think that it reaffirms the importance of our Constitution. At the end of the day, regardless of what the result is, that we, the public, should be proud of our democracy, that we've got the system of government that allows us these checks and balances that some other countries don't have. And so at the end of the day, we're seeing our Constitution being given effect and actually living in this day, being able to see one of the greatest powers of the check and balances on the president, which is I think just a awesome power for good and for bad, in that, if there's misconduct, that it allows us to keep our democracy. And so I'm hoping that the voters and the viewers stay tuned, because it's an important process that's happening.
You've got to be engaged, especially when there's so much political divisiveness in the process right now. But as you say, this process at least goes to show the government in action.
Absolutely. It is, and it reaffirms why we vote.
In there.
Right, and for our Constitution.
Eang Ngov, constitutional law professor with Barry University. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, my
I
pleasure.
appreciate it. And again, a lot more still playing out with this, so we are continuing to track these impeachment proceedings here on air and online.